Go ahead, Janet.
Hi, folks. Very good to see you all. At least not physically, but I know you're there because I've seen a list of those in attendance. And we're very pleased to welcome Linda Grimmel. She's from Niagara on the Lake, where she's worked with her father, Ernie Grimmel, cultivating and developing nut trees that we can grow here in Ontario. Using natural breeding techniques, not GMO. They have been actively breeding and selecting hazelnuts for 40 years. I've sampled the heart nuts that they have there, and I've purchased heart nut trees myself, and they're really delicious. I wanted to know what I was going to get one day, and they taste kind of like walnuts. Linda might correct me on this, but I think they're even better because they don't have that bitterness. Mind you, you have to use a sledgehammer to get them open to enjoy the nut meat. But they also have pawpaw trees, which I understand are native trees to Southern Ontario at least. And I've got a couple of those. So I'm waiting to see what happens with them and looking forward to learning more about nut trees. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Janet.
Okay, Linda, if you want to carry on with your presentation.
So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me tonight. The farm, the picture at the top kind of gives a good idea of what it looked like when we purchased the land. My father purchased the land in 1972. So it's quite barren. The bottom picture, I'm thinking, was taken around 2004, 2005, somewhere in there. The tree that's lower in the front now covers, I can't even take a picture from that vantage point anymore. Ernie started the farm in he started as a youth, very interested in what could grow in the Niagara region. Him and his friends would wander through the forest, which is now developed Niagara Falls homes, but they would wander around and they would pick up all kinds of nuts and mushrooms and whatever they could kind of forage, and they'd bring them back and their moms would cook with them. So that developed a lifelong passion for what you could eat that you could grow locally or what was found locally. He was a full-time teacher. So this, as he grew his passion, he was teaching full-time. He taught elementary, and I believe he taught between ages grades 4 to 8, mostly grades 5 and 6, I believe, though. And when he retired in 1994, he decided that this could actually be a business instead of just a hobby on the side. And so, although I grew up on the farm, I was born in Niagara Falls, but I grew up on the farm in Niagara on the Lake. And I was teaching in Arizona at the time. So I had married an American fellow. We were living in the States. And in the early 90s, the only place to find teaching jobs was Southern Arizona. So that's where we ended up. And but in the States, they don't have maternity leave. And so when my first child was born, I had to hand him over to a stranger when he was only 9 weeks old. And that ended my love of teaching. And at that point, my father had kind of expressed an interest in growing the business, and it would be nice to have one of us, my siblings or I, work with him. But as it was really quite small at the time, he felt that one would be all the farm could really support besides himself and my mom. So in 1999, my family and I moved back. And so I live in Niagara Falls. The farm is in Niagara on the Lake. And we have grown it into, my dad and I have worked very, very well together. We're very blessed to have a fantastic relationship, both with business and personal, to run especially we see each other every day. So to run a business together, it's quite nice. Unfortunately, none of my children are interested, but I didn't move back till I was 30, and my kids are in their young 20s. So we'll see if any of them show any interest in farming. We'll see. The nice thing about nuts and the business that we're in is that there's a strong importance, agricultural importance on nut trees. The Niagara region is part of the Carolinian forest. That's a huge part of south, that really the range is all southern Ontario. And there's a wide range of nuts that can be grown in that diverse forest area. It's also, nuts are also important for agricultural diversity. The nuts offer farmers an option to kind of the traditional farming crops. And sometimes there's people who just need to diversify their operation. A grape grower wants to have maybe a couple acres of hazelnuts. Cash croppers want to slowly put hazelnuts into their operations so that they're not always stuck with one commodity. So we have a very interesting and important crop trees that we're selling. So the Grimo Nut Nursery objectives. First of all, we have two parts to our farm, and I love this picture. Someone had asked if they could fly their drone over top of the farm. And usually when a pilot takes pictures, they were always capturing the farm from the front. So this angle is gorgeous with the lake in the background. And that long strip of trees is our farm. The gray part in the middle is a pond. So the part that surrounds, the parts that look like trees is, and I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this is all our test orchards. So this is where we test our selections. So what I mean in that is that someone might send us wood, and they'll say, and nuts, and they'll say, these nuts crack out perfect. There's something really spectacular about it. Then they send us the wood, and we graft those onto another tree, and we plant it in the orchard, and we test it for 10, 20 years, so that we can see if it's worth actually propagating and selling in the nursery part. We also do breeding, and I'll show you a bit about that. When we do breeding, like it was mentioned, we do natural selection. So there's no GMOs involved in this type of breeding work. It's all species specific to create the best trees with maybe the hardiest, disease resistance. All of that can be bred with the best selections that are out there. So we're always looking for something better. The orchard is also used for seed. So the nurseries depend on seed to grow the trees. We're very fortunate that we don't rely on another source to get seed. We grow it ourselves. So we gather the seed in the fall, we stratify it, and we plant it out in the spring. So we control our own cycle. Now, the nursery, the purpose of the nursery, of course, is the main part of the business. It's where people are able to select trees to plant in either their yards or research plantings or in their commercial orchards. We specialize in grafting, which people are quite often familiar with grafting when it has to do with fruit trees. You know that an apple tree is grafted when you're buying a gala tree. That is, the tree is grafted with gala wood buds on top of a rootstock. Seedling trees are just grown from seed. And the picture here shows hazelnut seedlings, just grown from seeds, nothing done to it, just straight seedlings. I like this page because it really shows how much we can really grow in Ontario. Out of the juglans, which is you can do black walnut, butternut, heartnut, Persian walnut, wortnut, which is actually a hybrid. Again, not a GMO hybrid, but just a heartnut crossed with a butternut to give you a hardier tree than the heartnut is. So it could be grown very easily in a colder climate than a heartnut can. Corylus are your hazels. So you can see the beaked hazel, the American hazel, both are native to North America and beaked specifically to Canada. The others, Heterophylla, the European and the Turkish, they have, they're from outside of North America. Castanea are your chestnuts. So American chestnut, which sometimes it gets referred to as Canadian chestnut, they are the most hardy, and they can be grown in North America and in our area. But there is a disease that comes in, and you can have a tree for 20 years and then it just gets wiped out by this disease. So it's a little bit frustrating, but chestnuts can be grown. Chinese chestnuts are actually resistant to that disease. So sometimes people will grow those, or hybrids, again, a Chinese crossed with American, bringing you the disease resistance of the Chinese, but the hardiness of the American. They're seedlings, so it's kind of hit or miss how those genetics are going to play out, but it's always interesting to see. Caria are your shagbark hickories. Shellbark would be a hickory as well. The shagbark are native to Southern Ontario. Pecan, the northern pecan is actually native to Iowa, but it can be grown in Ontario, and we get crops off our trees every single year. So they can be grown, but not in those colder areas. They just won't ripen. The Hican, again, is one of those oddball hybrids, a pecan and hickory. And so it's natural crosses. Someone may have done it, but it happens naturally without a lab being involved. Then we've got the beech, the ginkgo, we've got pines. Now pine nuts, and you'll see in some pictures as we go along, they grow in a pine cone, and they're absolutely beautiful and fantastic to eat, but they take a very long time to produce. We can also grow something called an apricot, which has an almond pit, but an apricot fruit. So it's kind of really nice because you get a delicious fruit and an almond pit that doesn't have science. Can't say it. It's not coming to me right now. It'll come. Cyanide, that's it. And the almond. We can grow almond here as well. We don't actually grow the apricot or the almond at our farm anymore because there's a plumpox virus that came into Southern Ontario. It was not eradicated fast enough. So we are now in a quarantine zone for that, and we have been for about 15 years. So I mentioned grafting, and I want to explain it a little bit because I think that it's a term that gets used and people don't often understand it. But essentially what you're doing is you're taking a rootstock or a tree, a seedling tree, and you're cutting it and inserting the wood of another tree. So in this picture, you can see the rootstock is the bottom. I have an arrow pointing to the graft union, and the top is is where the grafted wood was. And I show you where the original cutting was. And then a bud took off and grew, and that became a hard limb, so a hard branch. So it's not soft and green anymore, but that was the initial graft. So we graft to clone trees. We want to replicate trees by the thousands so that someone can have a whole orchard of, say, Gala apples, or maybe they want a specific apple, a Macintosh. So by grafting it, you're getting those superior characteristics over and over and over again. If anywhere you shop around the globe, if you buy an apple from anywhere that's called Gala, genetically it's coming from exactly the same tree or source originally. It's a clone of the original Gala tree. So you take branches and you ship them around the world, and people graft that. Each cultivar, as it's called, is given a name. So Gala is the cultivar name, and that identifies it. So this gives you an idea of what grafting looks like. So the diagram in the top left gives a good idea of what you're seeing in these pictures. We take the rootstock, we cut a line into it where you see it says stalk. Scion is the term for the wood that the specific cultivar that you're going to graft. You cut that so that you have a bud on it. You slide it into the rootstock and you bind it. Now I'll show you a little bit more here, how we do it. The center picture are kind of all the tools. The green thing is the piece of equipment that cuts the graft. We use pruners, the paintbrushes are for painting the wax on, and the masking tape. And then there's some buddy tape too. So the picture to the far right, top corner, we've got about 60 trees in that box, and they will be grafted to another, so those are Persian walnut rootstock, and the top of those trees will be another Persian walnut that we want to replicate. So they get put into a box with peat moss, and they're grown like that, and or kind of stored like that, I suppose, until we graft. So we start off with a box. Then Ernie's our head grafter right now because he can't go to Florida. So you can see him in the picture under the grafting box where he's cutting a piece of wood, and he's got his little table. His wax is set off to the left of, in that left, it's I think it's a crock pot. And in the picture that he's working on is a box of 9 trees, and those were black walnut grafted with black walnut on top. Had to look at the wood. So in the picture center right, he's cutting the wood. Bottom right, you can see that his cut has made a nice, his cyan wood is cut to the right angle. It's got a nice sharp point on it. The bottom center, he's quite happy with his cut. He puts it in, he binds it with the buddy tape, binds it with the masking tape, puts a sheet of paper towel around it, binds it again with masking tape, and then takes his wax and covers the entire, any cut surface must be waxed. So then those trees go into, so now I'm bottom left is what the 9 looked like when he was done. And above that is our sunroom where it's kind of creates an artificial greenhouse, and we've got a humidifier going, and the trees sit in there until they break bud. And then they move to a separate room. So he started grafting early this year to do some experiments. So that's grafting. So now we're looking at some of the nuts that grow well in Ontario. And so some of these trees you will have seen in your area, and they make, all of these trees make beautiful landscape trees. They're hardy, they're productive, they yield beautifully. You know, it's just nice. When we talk about edible landscaping or food security, nuts are really an important part of that. So the first one I'm going to start off with is black walnuts, because black walnuts are the most prevalent nut tree that's found around Southern Ontario in a wide range of areas. The black walnut often looks like a giant lemon as it grows and starts to ripen. And when we take that husk off, we have machines to do it, so they come out nice and clean like this. Sometimes when people are doing it at home, they won't come out as nice. But that's just because we can put them in machines, knock off those messy husks, wash them down, and then they look like that. And we dry them as well. The bottom center picture is what black walnut kernels look like. So when we crack open those nuts, black walnut is fantastic. It is probably one of my favorite nuts. It's got a rich, robust flavor. It's not bitter, but it's strong. Some people don't like it at all. They consider it a messy tree too, although it's absolutely beautiful, like in the picture. If they're not collecting the nuts, it does become a bit messy, but then you just collect them. The Persian walnut is an interesting one. I put AK English, Italian, California. The Persian, we call it Persian walnut because all walnuts that look like this originated in Persia. But what happened is that the trade routes would open up, and people in Persia would take these nuts and trade them with people in Italy, trade them with people in England, and trade them with people of all around Europe. And in the end, 500 years later, the English are calling it an English walnut. The Italians are calling it an Italian walnut. It's not. It's a Persian walnut. That's where it originates. But it's okay. We can be flexible with the terminology, but we do call it an English or a Persian walnut, not the English walnut. They're interesting in how they grow. They have a green husk on them as well. But the nice thing, the difference is between this and a black walnut is that the Persian walnut opens up and drops the nut nice and clean on the ground. So it's not as messy. And people are more familiar with this nut, so they know to pick it up and to kind of clean it off and to eat them. The tree is very pretty. It's very compact. The branching is very tight, and compared to the heart nut, which you'll see, this one is a compact type tree where the branching is very tight and making for a nice uniform tree. Persian walnuts, I do find a little bitterness in the aftertaste of them, but they're the most common walnut, and it's what people are often looking for. The heart nuts, that's probably our favorite. And the thing that would be fantastic with the heart nut is if we could ever get a cracker that would work efficiently on a commercial level. The heart nut is absolutely beautiful. It's a heart-shaped walnut that originated in Japan. But it was abandoned in Japan when the trade routes opened up and they were able to get Persian walnuts. So now they were cracking the Persian walnut, planting the Persian walnuts, and abandoned the heart nuts, because the heart nut can often turn into it. You could plant a heart-shaped nut, but the tree that grows could produce an oval nut. It's not genetically stable, so it sometimes reverts back to this oval shape. But they are a stunning tree. And as you see in the bottom left picture, when I spoke of the Persian walnut canopy, you can see how the heart nut canopy is very wide and lateral, and it's quite spectacular in its form. The picture in the top left, my dad and his wife, actually, that's our heart nut orchard. And when they got married in the heart nut orchard. It's absolutely beautiful. And the canopies overlap. It's just stunning, very pretty. There's my dad, Ernie Grimo, holding the heart nuts. And this picture on the bottom right is really stunning because the heart nut can grow, it grows in clusters like grapes. And sometimes you get, with good pollination, you get these fantastic, beautiful clusters hanging off the tree. So it's quite pretty. So I've been doing breeding on heart nuts since 2005. And basically the reason is when I looked at our cultivars, Imshu, Campbell CW1, Campbell CW3, Stealth, and Simcoe, there was a lot of room for improvement. So I took those as my mother trees and I used the pollen off one of the others. So when I did Imshu, I might have used pollen from CW3, Stealth, or Simcoe. And that way I was using what I considered to be our best cultivars to create newer ones. So I pollinated the flowers for several years in a row and planted out the seeds each year. I ended up with about almost 200 trees, and some died for one reason or another. It came down to that I worked with about 160 over the since 2007 when they all got planted in the nursery and out into the orchards. So over the years, I test, or I gather what I can off the trees. I actually go out and bag them. I put a mesh bag around the nuts as they form in those clusters, because if the nuts fall to the ground, I don't know what tree it came off. They're too close together. So I bag the nuts and I harvest them in their bags straight off the tree so that I know that the nuts in that bag belong to tree 89 or to tree 99 and that they're not tree 90 instead of 89. So it's quite a lot of work. I'm climbing up ladders and up in the trees. They're quite tall now, so I'm sometimes having to get a very long ladder. So these selections, the things that I like best about them, if you look at the cultivars on the left, the current ones, Imshu comes out whole. None of them have broken, but Campbell CW1 breaks, CW3 breaks. Stealth doesn't. It's quite nice in that way. And Simcoe does crack, it gets stuck. The new selections, not one of the ones that I've chosen breaks, which is what I want. I want a whole kernel so that, because that's the novelty of it. It's this beautiful heart-shaped nut. In the shell, it's quite pretty, but shelled, it's, I particularly like nuts 89 and 107. And the reason is they're firm. They have a nice shape. The only trouble with 107 is that it's small. It's nice for maybe someone who's doing a truffle and wants a little nut on top of it to highlight it, but otherwise it's a wee bit on the small side. So if you look in our website online, you would notice the Grimo selection say Grimo 89 or Grimo 94, whereas the others have names. I haven't named them yet, but I will eventually. Once I fine tune my selections, I'll give them names, more formal names. So we'll see what comes of that. Butternuts are another native nut. And the picture to the left are the flowers. Heartnut and butternut flowers are just so pretty. They're teeny tiny, but they're just lovely looking. The butternut is native. It's got a wide, hardy range. It's a very pretty tree. The leaves almost have a sticky texture to them, as do the nuts when they're growing on the tree. So if someone comes along and touches a tree or grabs for a nut, chances are their fingers are going to get a little bit sticky. The butternut is a little bit on the hard side to crack, but it has a really neat earthy flavor. It's quite lovely. But they've got a wide range of sizes as well. You can see the ones in the center are quite large compared to the ones around them. And that's quite normal. So hazelnuts are interesting because they can be grown in yards. There's a lot of beauty to them, but they can also be grown commercially in Southern Ontario. The Ferrero came into Brantford in 2005, or maybe they built their plant in 2005, 2006. And they expressed an interest in buying Ontario grown hazelnuts. And they worked with the Ontario Hazelnut Association to help get an industry developed so that they could eventually buy the nuts back from the farmers. So Ontario does have a very good growing hazelnut industry so that you can eventually find them in our own grocery stores, Ontario grown hazelnuts. So that's something to look forward to. And that's what an orchard of hazelnuts looks like in probably its 4th year. The top right picture, I just love that one because it's that tree happens to be called Crimson, and we're looking for others like it, where it's a little bit deceiving in this picture because the husk around the nutlets is still that bright reddish maroon, and the leaves are green. But in the spring, the leaves actually appear purpley. So and then the nuts grow and the leaves turn green. So it's quite pretty. We're not carrying Crimson any longer. I think this will be our last year, because if you look in the bottom center picture, what's growing there is a disease on the hazelnut, and that's Eastern filbert blight. It can wipe out an orchard in no time. It's a disease that our native trees are resistant to. So the beaked hazel and the American hazel are resistant to this disease, but the European hazels are not resistant. So when they started bringing European hazels to grow in Southern Ontario, because they can grow here, but they get blight and they die. So what they started to do is hybridize them. So Ernie started hybridizing. So taking American hazels or Heterophylla hazels, which come from Asia. And both of those are very hardy to zone 4, which is really important for those colder climates. So you took those cold hardy trees and crossed them. So the flower of the hardy one crossed with the pollen of the European hazel. And over time, you start to develop, you plant all those seedlings out, and the ones that get blight, you take down, and the ones that don't, you continue to monitor and to see how they progress over the years. So the ones that get blight, you just get rid of them. The ones that are resistant, then you evaluate and observe for years to come. We've had Crimson for quite a long time, and just last year it broke into blight. So we are cutting down the tree. The bottom right picture is Ernie. So what we've been doing in the last 4 years is we took pots, and in that picture, he's standing beside a pot that has, or a packaged group of trees that has 2 potted trees in it. So there's one at the bottom and then one stacked on top. They were actually tied together so the 2 trees could cross-pollinate in that little pollination tent. That's how we did the breeding. The pollen of one pollinated the flower of the other and vice versa. So they essentially did the cross-pollination in that tent, and then we'd gather the seed and we'll grow them out again. So when Ernie did his original selections 40 to almost 45 to 35 years ago, within that range, he came out with some excellent selections. But from those selections, we're now trying to see even better ones. So that's what that project is about. And the trees are still quite young, but in the next 10 years, we'll be able to say, hey, these are doing quite well. So we'll see. Chestnuts are a fantastic nut. Most people think you can get them, that they grow or that they're ripe or available at Christmas because of the song, roasting chestnuts by an open fire, but they're actually harvested in October. So when people come to our farm in December looking for chestnuts, they've missed it by 2 months. Chestnuts have a prickly burr. The bottom left-hand picture, if you look closely, you'll see a man standing in the trees. This is an old photo from the early 1900s where the chestnut tree thrived throughout North America on the eastern coast, up the Appalachians, into Nova Scotia, into Ontario. And the trees were really important for the ecosystem. Cabins were, like log homes were made out of chestnut. The wood doesn't rot. So it made a spectacular home. And it was used for instruments, and it was used for, the nuts would drop and people would live off them. It was part of their sustenance, their diet, and they could store them and eat them all winter long. The same with the butternut and the black walnut. But when the disease came through, within 10 years, the Appalachians were bare. The trees were dead. It looked like a fire had gone through. There's just sticks. The trees had died. There's different groups in North America. There's Canadian Chestnut Council, and there's a couple in the US that are working to breed naturally, again, flower and pollen, taking the Canadian chestnut trees that have survived, somehow naturally resistant, and crossing them with other American to try and breed for more resistant trees. You can look that group up there. It's an interesting story. The bottom center picture is the pollen on a chestnut, which I just love the look of, because it looks, when you look at the trees, like the one at the right, it looks like there's caterpillars all over it, but it's just the fuzzy, looks like a pipe cleaner of pollen. Chestnuts are fantastic. They're a different kind of nut. They do not have a hard shell. They have a paper type, thick paper. But you use just a knife to cut in and to prepare them for eating. Hickory and pecan. So the hickory is native to Southern Ontario, and it has spectacular fall colors. It's just a gorgeous tree. The pecan is fantastic as well. The colors aren't the same, but the tree is just a gorgeous tree. And when you can actually get nuts off both trees, it's wonderful. You've got some great landscape trees. The hickory, I believe, was used also. The hickory, black walnut, butternut, hazelnut, and the pawpaw fruits were used by the indigenous people, and they taught the early settlers to harvest from those trees to provide sustenance for the winter. So hickory and pecan are also fantastic trees. Here are the nut pines. So nut pines, or when you buy pine nuts at the grocery store, this is exactly what what it's growing. It grows on a specific pine tree. Not every pine tree can have an edible pine nut. And the reason is, it's not that the others don't taste good. It's just that they're tiny. You can't get them out. The birds would eat them. Humans wouldn't bother. Pine nuts take 2 years to grow inside their cones. The center picture shows the cones growing, and they're green. Some in the top of that center picture are still very tiny. And the one at the bottom of that picture is green, but has started to open up the petals on the cone. And in the third picture, the one to the right, the cones have dried and they drop to the ground. Now, chances are you cannot buy pine nuts that are grown in Ontario. And that is because of the time that it takes to grow an orchard, and the labor it takes to get those nuts down, cracked, and ready to eat. So chances are when you're buying pine nuts, they're coming from China or Russia. Now, they're the only nuts I would ever say to don't worry, just go ahead and buy the international nuts. Everything else, do your best to find local. But with those, there's just no way. Canadians cannot compete. Those two countries have a history of growing these pine trees. They've got 100, 200, 300-year-old orchards. And they send peasants up the tree with sticks to knock them down, or children. My kids wouldn't go up a pine tree, no matter how much I tried to pay them, because they're sticky, it's messy, it's rough. And so our country's just not going to do it. But they are fantastic nuts, especially when they come straight out of the cone. The taste is amazing. So we also sell some minor fruits, and the pawpaw, which is in the top left, is the one that I mentioned before as a native fruit. So there's a basket of pawpaw fruit there and a picture of a fruit that I cut open, and you can see the dark seed in it, and you can see my spoon. I like to cut them in half and just scoop it out and eat it, spitting out the pits. You wouldn't want to eat the pits because they're toxic. Even animals, if they come along the ground and find a pawpaw on the ground, then they will eat the fruit and leave the pits or the seeds. So pawpaws are, some people call it, well, in Michigan, they call it a Michigan banana. Some call it a custard-like fruit. Some people say it's a mix of a banana and a mango. I don't know how to describe it because it's amazing. It's tropical tasting. The tree looks tropical, but to say it tastes like a mango or a banana, I don't get that. I tell you, think of when you buy those really exotic fruit and they've got those spectacular flavors, but it doesn't taste like anything you've ever eaten before. That's a pawpaw. Nothing you can compare it to, but wonderfully sweet and beautifully fragrant. So the pawpaw is really one of those neat trees to grow and to gather the fruit from. As a matter of fact, there's some that grow wild in the native forest still around here. And when someone finds a pawpaw tree, they'll come and tell me, but they won't tell anyone where that tree is. It's like top secret, so that they can get there and harvest that fruit themselves in the fall. The picture in the center and to the right are fig trees. Fig trees are not native and they cannot grow outside, although sometimes people say they can, but we have not found them to be successful growing outside unless they're protected or covered, or it's rare when you actually can have a fig tree that can survive our winters, especially this winter's been really cold. I can't imagine someone keeping their fig tree outside that it would be okay. Bottom left is mulberry. They're not native, but they are lovely. We do sell a red mulberry, and the red mulberry is native, but the grafted ones are not from native sources. The bottom right looks like oranges growing on a tree, and it's not. It's actually American persimmon. They're not native here either, but they are a fantastic fruit. Now, you do have to wait until they ripen fully and they look as orange and bright as the fruit on these trees or on this tree, because if you eat them when they first start looking nice and crisp and lovely, they will dry out your mouth and you will never do that again. So you got to wait till American persimmon ripen up and they're mushy and soft and wonderfully sweet. So that's an unusual one, but quite nice. So people often ask, how do you harvest nuts? How do you climb up those trees? We don't, nothing. We don't climb any trees. We let them drop to the ground. So the picture to the left top is some tools that are very, very handy. They're called a wizard. And we carry 4 sizes. And if you look closely, you can see that in the center one, there's little nuts like hazelnuts. The one to the left has heart nuts in it, and the one to the right has black walnuts. And so we used specific sizes. These are great for backyard use, but I also encourage new orchardists. For the first couple years, their orchard's not going to be in huge production, but they don't want to miss anything. So these tools are really handy because you just roll them on the ground, the nuts pop into the cage, and you just keep right on going. So they're very handy for commercial growers that are in their early years, or backyard growers. Now, even though I say orchardists in their early years, that's Ernie on the picture to the right, and he's driving a harvester. On top of the harvester, he carries a wizard for whatever tree he happens to be harvesting, because when he's done, he hops off the harvester and rolls the tool around to make sure that any that didn't get picked up, he can gather very easily. We do not bend over to pick up nuts. It's way too much work. The bottom 2 pictures are other types of harvesting equipment. We don't have them, but they're really interesting options for other people. The one on the left, the man has a vacuum set up so that he would stop that vehicle or stand in and wave the vacuum and collect the nuts as he goes. The picture to the right is what bigger orchardists would use to have a harvesting machine and a tow behind bucket to drop the nuts in. Sometimes I think that'd be really handy, but our little machine works quite well. People often ask, how in the world do you get these nuts clean? Well, this is how we do it. The picture at the top is Ernie, probably 30 years ago, and the machine we still have in use. He was pouring nuts into this hopper. There's an auger that goes around the center. It's quite fast and with paddles on it, and it smacks off the hulls. Then the nuts come flying out the end after it passes through the auger, and the mess falls out the bottom. So then we scoop that up and put it in a giant compost pile in the orchard. Now, if it doesn't go through that setup, it goes through the second one where we call that orange machine a cleaner. We dump nuts in on the right-hand side, it goes up a belt, gets smacked around with a more gentle brush system. And then the walnuts and the chestnuts come out that machine. So only the messy nuts go through the green machine, and the cleaner nuts go through the orange one. From there, everything goes down to a cement mixer with slots cut out of it. And that, of course, turns. We spray water into it, and that's what gives the nuts a nice, clean look to them. From there, I don't have a picture of it, but they do get sanitized. And then they go into dryer boxes. So the one box is turned on its side so you can see the base of the box. And those screens sit over a hole in the plenum, and the air gets forced through it with an old furnace fan. The barn air blows through the nuts and dries them. It takes about 5 to almost 10 days. This fall was so wet, it took 10 days to dry the nuts. So the longer they sit on it, it's harder for harvest because we've got a cycle of things trying to come in and get on those dryers, but that's essentially it. And then they come out quite nice. They've been sanitized. We do have to sanitize nuts. It's part of the food safety rules and regulations. So there's processes involved in this too. So some people are very familiar with why nuts are important. But they're incredibly important to your diet. They're rated one of the top 10 foods that's a superfood, especially the walnuts that are high in omega-3 and 6. Walnuts and some of the others lower risk of heart disease and diabetes. Because of the omegas, they actually fight cholesterol. So people who have heart issues should be having a handful of walnuts every day, and keeping in mind what the walnuts are. It's a Persian walnut, a black walnut, a heart nut, butternut, or the hybrids. So any of those count as being a walnut because they're all from the walnut family. I use the picture of the Persian walnut because that's the one that's easiest to find in your stores and the one that's most readily available. They are high in fiber, they're high in protein, and they have antioxidants. So they really are an amazing superfood. how do they get used? We just eat them raw. We just, once they're dried and they taste nice, we don't fully dry them. They've still got a very moist taste to them, but not as dry as a grocery store has to. But we eat them fresh. We cook with them. It's funny, but I didn't start eating snacks or treats with nuts in them until I was an adult, because I just liked eating them raw. I didn't want it in my baked goods. I just wanted to eat them separate, wanted my cookies without nuts. But cheeses are now being made out of nuts as well. Cashew cheeses are very popular for vegans and vegetarians. So I have my son who lives in Vancouver, but he's done his culinary training, and I send him heart nuts and I say, start to figure out how to do a heart nut cheese, because the heart nut has a very nice chewy texture to it, different than the other walnuts, and it's milder. It's got a fantastic flavor, but I think it would be an ideal nut to use for a vegetarian cheese. So I got him working on that. So the nuts for eating, the most common ones are actually the chestnuts in the bottom right, the walnuts in the top left. Those would be the two. Oh, hazels. I don't have a picture of hazels in here. Heart nut is one of our favorites. My dad's ultimate favorite, though, is the hickory nuts, and he eats those probably every day for lunch. His lunch is very simple. It's nuts, an apple, some fruit, but always nuts. Sometimes pizza, but always nuts. Butternuts are the ones in the top right. And that's it. So I'm excited to hear your questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Linda. We have a few questions. Just to repeat, if you wish to type down a message, type out a message, a question for Linda, you can type it at the bottom of your screen. We have a few questions here, but before I do that, if you can, let's see here, if you can stop your presentation.
There we go.
There you go. Okay. I'm going to show something here. I'm going to share something with you.
Yes.
Now, one of the members sent this in to me prior to the presentation and asked, can you identify what these are?
Yeah, I think that's a bitter nut hickory. You don't want to mistakenly eat those. They are terrible. And just as the name implies, they are bitter. So if I'm correct and you were to peel, so the skin has dried around them, but if you were to peel that off and crack the nut inside, because the skin's still on them, I think they might be empty. But if they were, if you could peel the fresh skin off and it came off and you cracked it open, just take a nibble first. I made that mistake once. So I tell you, be gentle with it, to go lightly on your bite. Yeah, the bitter nuts are really bitter. They're awful. So that's what I think that is.
Okay, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
And I've got another one to share as well. I just want to, it's another question that was sent in by Terry Morocco. And at the very end of this, it has Hort speakers list. Let's see, can whoever is booking the speakers ask in advance on nuts? How do we gardeners harvest and use black walnuts in a reasonable way?
Yeah, so black walnuts, the best thing to do is get some really good thick rubber gloves. And don't chintz on the rubber gloves. Get some really good thick ones. And when you pick up the walnuts, put them in a bucket. And then as they soften, as that husk softens, you're going to use your rubber gloves again. Never touch them without the gloves. You're going to pull that husk off because it will come off after they soften. And then put them in another basket or, put them in a basket or bucket. Rinse them outside with a hose, not inside. You don't want to do anything in your house because the black walnut stain is incredible. And it will stay on your hands for a good 2 to 3 weeks. So you want to be very careful with that. You don't want it in your house. You want, even when you're washing the nuts, do it away from the house so that you're not going to walk in it. No pets will walk in it. One lady, she went through this whole process and then said she accidentally walked through the water and now had, at that point, had black linoleum footsteps going through her, black footsteps going through her linoleum. So you want to keep that messy water away from everything. And then once you've rinsed them off, you want to put them in like an onion bag or a potato bag and hang them in your basement. I like the furnace room because it's always the warmest, driest room in the house. But also put a rotating fan, just a table fan or a stand fan, and just have the air circulating in the room. It just will help them dry. And then after, you want to shake the bag maybe once a week, just so that the nuts in the center of the bag are rotating around and getting the air pass through them. And then by November, December, they'd be really nice to eat. Okay. So that's the home gardener way. I also like using the Wizard or some of the other tools that are that you just stand and roll. It just makes it really easy. You don't have to bend over to pick up things.
Thanks
unless you have grandchildren.
Thanks very much, Linda.
You're welcome.
Terry Morocco again. I have black walnut tree, get 6 bushels of nuts. Would like to know how to harvest and eat them. Would make picking them up more interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, you definitely want to harvest them. You've got them growing. You can collect 6 bushels. If you go online, you can find some, because 6 bushels, if you had 1 bushel, do it by hand. It's 1 bushel is not a huge amount, but 6 bushels, that's a lot of work. So if you go online and start Googling some ways to hull or husk black walnuts, there's always, people come up with some really ingenious ideas. And so there might be something that works better and faster than pulling them apart by hand. We also sell some crackers that would make it easier to get into them. We have a Duke black walnut cracker. It's not as good as the original that it was copied from. There's a fella in the States that made it called a master nut cracker. It's fantastic. The Duke one isn't bad. And the reason we carry the Duke is we just couldn't get the master nut cracker. The gentleman makes them from scratch and he just couldn't keep up with demand. So something like that. We also carry, but it's, I don't know, for 6 bushels, that's going to come down to maybe 1 or 2 bushels of nuts out of the husk. We also sell a hard nut cracker, like it cracks hard nuts, that works on the black walnuts, but I think it's kind of pricey, so it might be a little too much. But the Duke would be a good one. It's a ratcheting latch, and it would make cracking them in and getting them open easier.
Okay. Along the same subject on black walnut tree, Susan Watson says, I have a black walnut tree and I'm wondering about growing seedlings from the nuts.
Yep, absolutely. So in the fall, you're going to do the same process. You're going to gather them with gloves. You're going to take off the husk. You're going to rinse them, but then you're going to put them in peat moss, moist peat moss. Make sure that it's not wet, but not dry. It's somewhere in between. And you're going to put a tie around the bag, label it, my black walnuts, stick it in the fridge or the crisper until spring. And then you plant them out in May.
Next question is from Janet Sedgwick. Do you use a brush to do the pollination?
Yeah, I do a few different things. So normally when I do like my heart nuts, I found the brush frustrating because my pollen that I'd gathered, I'd keep in an envelope so that I could see the yellow pollen against the white envelope. But when I put a paintbrush in, it would get like just a little children's paintbrush, something small, because the flowers are like the size of the tip of the white part of your nail. So it's just very small. But I found that too much pollen was getting stuck in the whole head of the paintbrush. So I just started using my finger, and I just dip my finger into the pollen. You can see the yellow on your finger, and then just brush it onto the flower very, very gently. So I prefer using my finger. I find it a little more, I can tell, I can see it. It's kind of nice that way. But one of the things I tried with our hazelnuts this past, not this winter, but the winter before, is they've done some experimenting with squirt bottle pollen. So I tried that as well. I had poor pollination anyway. The trees were performing very strangely. So I don't know if it was because of my pollination technique or if the pollen wasn't viable, but it didn't work very well. I like the finger the best.
Okay. Patricia McCaw, is there a nut tree that I could plant and get a harvest in something like 5 years?
Yep. Hazels produce in 3 years. Grafted trees produce in 3 years, except for hickory and pecan. They still take 8 to 10. But a grafted tree or a hazelnut seed, a hazelnut layer or seedling, doesn't matter. Hazelnuts will produce in 3 years. The only trouble with hazels is that, it's sad because they're one of the most versatile plants. They're absolutely fantastic. They can fit in everybody's yard. It's the smallest of trees next to the pawpaw, but squirrels can get them easily. So if you've got squirrels running around your neighborhood, chances are once they find your hazelnut tree or bush, you're not going to get too many. So some of the other trees, if you can keep them away from the house long enough, you'll get crops. You'll get nuts off them anyway, but not as heavy as you would if you could protect the tree. If the squirrels can jump from your house to the tree or a fence to your tree, you've got very little control over it at that point. But when the trees are young, you'll get nuts.
Okay, Marion Castleton, what percentage of grass would you expect to survive?
Okay, so I look at this in two different ways. When we do our grafting, I expect Ernie to get 90%. But that depends on, so if all the conditions are perfect, he's going to get 90% success. However, when you take, there's a bunch of things that can reduce that. If we have a bad year and the wood is dying back, like a cold, like this winter's been cold, some of the Persian walnut wood may die back, and then that affects the grafting wood. Sometimes if the conditions were the roots, you saw those, the roots that were in that, in those boxes, or that you didn't see the roots, you saw the trees growing in the boxes. If the moisture isn't right in those, they die. So there's all kinds of factors, but if all the factors are good, he should be able to get 90%. However, then we plant those trees out into the nursery in May. So all his newly grafted trees will go out into the nursery rows, and we lose a bit more. So again, it depends if we've got, if they get watered well, if they get fertilized well, if we don't have a drought or we don't have incredible rain, if all the conditions are right, we shouldn't lose too many from there. But there's years where sometimes they put on a huge amount of growth, and if we don't cut those suckers off below the graft, the rootstock takes over and kills the graft. So that's important to watch too. If you let your rootstock grow, you've just killed your graft. So in the end, we probably, with all, there's always, nothing ever comes out 100% perfect condition. So I'd say 75% is fairly reasonable. Okay.
Thanks very much. Harriet Binkley says, when is the best time of year to come to buy fresh nuts at, is it Grimo or Grimo?
It's Grimo. Grimo, yeah. The best time for fresh nuts. So I would say October into the first week of November. So we have a little of everything ready the first couple weeks of October, but the last couple weeks of October, everything's in stock. The first couple weeks are really stressful because people want to come and they call constantly. Are the chestnuts ready? Are the walnuts ready? Are the heart nuts ready? Are this? And chances are we have a little bit in, but not enough that it's very stressful. But yeah, October and into early November is the best time to come.
Okay, and final comment, many thanks for walnut tips from Terry Morocco.
Oh, thank you.
And let me just see if there's any other, that was the last question. So I'm going to pass it over to Janet to thank you, Linda.
Oh, no, thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. That was very informative, and your enthusiasm is quite contagious. I think a lot of us are going to experiment with nuts, or at least come down Grimaud Way and check things out. I know my husband and I were saying we want to get down there when the pawpaws are ripe and to try that. We've never tasted something like that.
Yeah, they are spectacular.
Yeah, you and your dad are quite the pioneers and quite the scientists. There's all and inventors too when you see the tools that you use, and you appreciate and point out to us that how important diversity is in growing nuts and farming nuts. And I just really appreciate all that you shared with us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording right now.